I think the most common misunderstanding in the general public is that psychedelic substances can be used to successfully treat depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. Because if you closely look at the evidence, it just doesn't back up that these substances are safe or are actually efficient treatments for these pathologies. And if I were to name one biggest misconception among scientists, it would be that psychedelics work by resetting the brain, by making new connections, by fostering connectivity between different networks, and hence resulting in a mental reset. That's a very compelling idea. And entropic brain hypothesis and rebus model have been really influential and are very interesting theoretical ideas that unfortunately are currently not yet backed up by the empirical data. So It's a bold statement, but I really think we should be cautious with those explanations.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Anxiety Podcast. I am in the Netherlands right now in a lovely workshop on epistemology of psychedelics. And today I have a very special guest, Michiel van Elk. And he has done a lot of tremendous work. He was a speaker here in the workshop. He gave a talk yesterday, which was very interesting. And so he was kind enough to accept this invitation to just have a chat here about psychedelics, about religion and its connections to psychedelics, and all the surrounding topics. So I'm really looking forward to it. And yeah, Michiel, well, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for the invite. Happy to be here.
Amazing. So let's just jump right into it. Obviously, you are quite a heavy figure in kind of like the science of psychedelics. So people that are in the field very likely have heard your name, but for maybe people that aren't even in psychedelics at all, which it is a little bit of the audience, and people are just very much into religion or very much into philosophy, but like not so much interested in this specific field. Could you just give like a brief introduction about who you are and kind of what type of work you do?
Yes, of course. Also about my intellectual background, where I come from.
Yeah, we can get that as well later, but maybe for now, just like give a brief one-on-one on your work.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I don't consider myself a heavy person in the field at all. But I'm currently affiliated as associate professor at Leiden University in psychology, in the cognitive psychology department, since 5 years now. And I teach in the bachelor and master program in psychology, a course on consciousness and a course on how to conduct and evaluate empirical research. And next to that, I spend a lot of time conducting research myself, and we have a research group consisting of 5 PhD students and 1 postdoc that is called the PRiSM Lab, and the acronym PRiSM stands for Psychedelic, Religious, Spiritual and Mystical Experiences. And we try to study these experiences using multi-methods approaches, including neuroimaging, psychophysiology, experiments, subjective data, questionnaires, interviews, etc. And maybe also personally, I live in Amsterdam, where I live with my 2 kids who are currently 16 and 19 years old. And I have a lot of hobbies, amongst them sports and playing music. Oh, that's maybe a short bio.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. And how are you finding the workshop so far?
I enjoy it. I didn't anticipate when I was invited for this workshop that it would be so heavy on the philosophy side of things. So most of the attendees here are philosophers. And although I studied philosophy myself, I don't consider myself a philosopher. But I deem the questions that are studied and asked at this workshop, like what is the nature of reality? Do mystical experiences reveal some kind of knowledge? How can we find out? I deem those questions really relevant, and I've often been fascinated by similar questions myself as well.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I find it funny that maybe you kind of like stumbled upon a more philosophical environment that you were expecting. But that also leans nicely, which is like, I also wanted to ask, like, how exactly do you see the role of philosophy? And I would also be interested if you just like kind of explained a little bit your position on philosophy and science, but obviously more specifically within the fields of psychedelics. Because from my experience, it's actually, there's usually two main camps that I find within the science of psychedelics, which is people are either completely ignoring any philosophical things, they just think it's not relevant, or they're actively antagonist to it. And the third camp is very, very rare from my experience. But obviously it exists, and we've seen it during this workshop. So people are working on it. But like, how do you see this dialogue in between the two?
Yeah, I think I find myself also balancing back and forth between being somewhat skeptical about theoretical or too philosophical approaches to the topic of altered states or psychedelics, because there's a lot of speculation, a lot of theory over the past 100 years or so that has resulted in a couple of interesting ideas. But at the same time, these discussions, if you look back at William James, seem to be a bit repetitive. Like, we still discuss the same questions that he put on the agenda. So that's why I think personally, at a certain point in my career, I decided to focus more on the empirical side of things and to use neuroscientific methods to study altered states. But then on the other hand, I work in psychology and I am fascinated by the topic of altered states. And every time we do research, I realize the importance of better theories. And philosophy can help there in terms of providing more conceptual clarity about what we're actually measuring, about what a psychedelic experience actually is, how we should go about measuring mystical type experiences. And that's where I really see, I think, a need in the field, that in psychology we have all those cool tools and methods for conducting empirical research, but we have very poor tools for developing and evaluating good theories. And this is where I think philosophy can really help. And that's also what I see at this workshop, that there are great ideas about how we should go about studying these states.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a very reasonable perspective. I do wonder, though, like, when you say like speculation, I just wonder how exactly do you see that kind of speculation, which is a bit more on the heavier side and sometimes on metaphysics, compared to, because when you mention like we need better theories in psychology, for example, that kind of go above the method, like I feel like people sometimes take that a little bit not serious enough, because it's not just like an actual like addition on top of kind of like the paradigm that you have in psychology, but it's actually fueling a lot of new paradigms, right? So it's not just like, oh, let's think about this slightly different. It's more about, from time to time, you do have certain paradigm shifts in psychology, and those are fueled largely by the kind of thinking that in the beginning is kind of labeled by speculation, because it's always very abstract in the beginning, right? And then you have to kind of trace your thought of like, okay, how this super abstract thing, how can this connect to a possible new theory? How would that then translate to empirical work and whatnot? So do you see kind of like a distinction that you try to differentiate? So it's kind of like, okay, there's this speculation, which is like maybe a little bit too out there. So like, maybe let's try to focus on psychology and kind of just abstract a little bit out of it. Or do you see it has kind of like a continuum?
Well, I think the real problem in psychology is that indeed there's a lot of speculation and that we don't add precision to the so-called theories that we develop. By that I mean that a lot of the theories that we use in psychology are so-called narrative theories that you might come up with in a bar, like, hey, thinking about human behavior, it could well be that maybe if people think about death, and if you're reminded of death, that somehow you want to cling to something that makes meaning, and people become more religious. And hey, hence terror management theory is born. So they start doing experiments, priming people with death primes and showing that they believe more in God if you prime them with death, but then that doesn't replicate. But it's no wonder that it doesn't replicate, because that is not really a theory proper. That death primes will actually make people more religious. For how long should they be reminded of death? What is actually death? What is religion? How should you go about measuring it? So there's a lot of imprecision in the field and a lot of speculation, and we don't add the specificity that is actually required to make the theory actually testable. So I think that is the problem that I'm currently thinking about and trying to see how we could resolve it. Yeah. But also, and that also speaks to the philosophy of psychedelics, sometimes I have the feeling that some ideas can be reiterated from other fields. So, for instance, we just had a talk here at this workshop by Jussi Jelka about the epistemic implications of mystical type experiences. And it reminded me of my own philosophy studies 20 years back by now, in which I wrote my thesis on Alvin Plantinga, the epistemology of the American philosopher. And he was actually asking quite similar questions about, like, if you have, for instance, an experience of God, to what extent does that result in warranted true belief that God must exist? And he speculates about the sensus divinitatis, and he might point to brain areas involved in religious experiences of believers. So I'm sometimes thinking that we are kind of reinventing the wheel, and we have a lot of things to gain from other fields. For instance, now in the discussion on the epistemic status of mystical experiences.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I think that's super important. I'm actually like one of the biggest proponents of like this interdisciplinary nature of it, which I think is quite important to what you're saying. And I think, I think that's actually one of the things that held back our thinking for a long time. It's just because academia has lived in silos for so long, when there's kind of like psychology people, there's a philosophy people, there's a religion people, and like we don't talk to each other. You know, everyone is a heretic except my own little group. So I would love to dive a little bit into your personal background in terms of like your religious experiences as you were growing up. And I've seen you talk a little bit about it. I think maybe in some podcasts or something, maybe some articles. So no need to like go very deep, but just to make people listening kind of aware of the context, and then kind of we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So in short, my fascination for the topic of altered states can be traced back to me having been grown up in a Pentecostal context, in a Pentecostal church in the Netherlands, with ecstatic events, exorcism, faith healing, prophecy, speaking in tongues. And I witnessed those events as a child, and I was really fascinated by these experiences, had some experiences myself. But at the same time, I had a very, openness to experience and an inquisitive mindset to find out how these experiences could be explained. And I was reading deeply into the literature on neuroscience and the psychology of religion, and started to doubt more and more whether all these experiences could be explained maybe in a more reductionistic or atheistic framework compared to the theistic framework that I had grown up with. So that has been a driving force in my personal background, but also in my professional academic background.
Right. And so just for me to have a little bit more context, like at what age did you kind of like move past a little bit from that context?
Yeah, so those experiences. So I was in the church while I was a teenager, and still as a student, I was quite active. So I was having these kind of two streams of thought. One was the religious belief self, and the other was more the scientifically oriented. And I tried to reconcile those for quite some time until at a certain point it felt like the scientific weight shifted my entire worldview, and I suddenly realized God does not exist. I became atheist from one day to another, and then I felt more coherence in terms of those worldviews finally being able to merge together. But at the same time, a deep existential question like, what does it all mean, and why have I lived my life the way I did so far? And everything that I took for granted suddenly became questionable. So that has, been a challenge, but also an interesting quest over the past couple of decades since that happened. So then I was, I think, 21 or 22 when that happened. Mm-hmm. So I would say quite late compared to when other people lose the faith.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. And I'm a little bit fascinated by your backgrounds, even though it's not, I wouldn't say it's particularly special, it's very common. But from my perspective, I'm a little bit of the opposite, which is like when I was young, when I was a teenager, I was like very secular, like completely atheists, even though I don't like their words, and like very scientific, very standard scientific education. And then only, I would say like, I started probing on it kind of in my late teens, and then kind of like on my early 20s. That's kind of like when I started taking religion a bit more seriously. And one of the things that kind of changed my mind was that the image that I had of religion was, in my opinion, just not very sophisticated. I felt like it was a caricature of religion that everyone was kind of telling me, that my culture was telling me. And that's kind of what made me reevaluate its place in my thought, and that maybe I should study it a bit more seriously, and that it's not just like some silly superstition that people are coming up with, even though obviously it has a lot of those elements as well. And I'm curious if you ever considered this to have an effect on your own progression. If you ever looked back and thought, even though I've progressed this far in my worldview, how much of that has been conditioned by how I was conceptualizing religion, rather than, oh, this religion can't fit into the scientific kind of framework that I have in mind. And specifically because, obviously this is very biased, so everyone forgive me, but I would say that the brand of religion that you experience is already like a very heavily modernized version of it. So like what I would say is kind of like, yeah, you had to struggle reconciling that, but also like that's very specific to the context that you're in. And I think that there's a lot of more healthier, more educated, a bit more sophisticated, even though that's a bit of an holistic term, that you can play with those things. So I'm just wondering, like, if these kinds of thoughts have ran through your minds, and kind of like how you dealt with it.
Interesting. And if I may ask, were you raised? Were your parents religious at all? Did they have any?
Completely secular. Like I'm very shameful to admit it, but like I was the typical militant atheist that would just like basically debate anyone I could. Like I loved religious debates. I would even make fun of people sometimes because I was very stupid when I was very young. And so like absolutely zero religious background whatsoever. And
do you consider yourself religious or spiritual now, if you were asked?
That's a very dense question, but I would say yes. Yeah. But I would say in the sense that I think I typically, let's put it like this, I typically try to stay within a naturalistic paradigm. So like I generally don't grant something like what people call the supernatural. But I take a very existential and phenomenological approach where how I like to phrase it is that I think reality is inherently religious and therefore I'm religious.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe going back to the question you were asking me, indeed, I've, of course, reconsidered the specific environment in which I grew up, but I've never become anti-religious at all. I never had those sentiments. Actually, I always saw really much value and a lot of meaning in having been grown in that environment, like the music, for instance, the ecstasy, the very powerful experiences, but also the coping mechanisms it provides, the social support. And in that sense, I have not have not been very negative or anti-religious at all, but always have held dear memories. And also am keen to point out that being religious comes with a lot of benefits in terms of for your mental and physical health. Like all the studies showing that being religious actually makes people happier, healthier, and it can even extend their lifespan. There's even hard data to suggest that people live 1 or 2 years longer if they are part of a religious community for that reason. But I actually felt more alienated when I started reading about the scientific explanations of religion. So I also started reading into Dawkins and Dennett's Religion Explained, came across the cognitive science of religion and was reading deeply into the literature, trying to explain religion from a kind of naturalistic perspective. But I felt a bit disappointed by that literature because it felt to me like those philosophers and scholars were approaching the phenomenon from a philosopher's armchair perspective, as if they were talking about some abstract form of religion with a God up high in the sky who was watching us, and very abstract beliefs that didn't resonate at all with my personal experiences within that church. So I actually felt disappointed by the reductionist and scientific explanations that I encountered. And I was actually more intrigued when I came across the work of Tanya Luhrmann, who has been quite influential in my thinking, who was an anthropologist at Stanford University. And she has this book, When God Talks Back. And she conducted anthropological research on voice-hearing experiences in Pentecostal Christians. And when I read her work, I had the feeling that this was really a person who, for the first time, was actually able to nail down what it is like to grow up in that kind of specific church, and the kind of psychological processes that are going on in terms of real making, the spiritual exercises that people engage in. And from there, I started seeing those patterns also in other religious movements, like in yogic tantric practices or in meditation, in which people also engage in a similar process of training. And that if you immerse yourself within that framework, it's a learning experience. And over time, you create your own kind of reality. And that is what I could relate to from firsthand experience, even though I left that framework behind. So that's how I relate to my past and how I view this specific tradition. But it took me a long time to find out someone who actually seemed to be able to do justice to also the particular aspects of this tradition, which is, of course, highly idiosyncratic and Western and modern and individualistic in a way.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's super interesting. And it's funny because I was just going to talk about kind of coming to science of religion, psychology of religion next. And it was also a field that was very influential for me. That's actually one of the things that kind of opened my eyes, because when I started studying philosophy, studying psychology, one of the reasons that forced me to pay more attention to religion was the fact that it felt that it was warranted because it was such a massive cultural force. So you just had to kind of grapple with it. And I started grappling it with almost as like a philosopher or an anthropologist of like, what could this possibly mean? And obviously there's kind of like some easy answers. You're like, people are just dumb and they believe dumb things. But, you know, once you look into it, it is a little bit more complicated than that. And so I was very interested in kind of following that path. But eventually I found it a little bit disappointing in many ways. I felt like it was quite reductivist in some ways. So the way that I saw people approaching was, number one, like, I think now it's a bit better, but like when I was reading this stuff like several years ago, like the hyperdetection kind of agency type hypothesis was like super popular. And I always felt like clearly on the supernatural, clearly that has an effect of some kinds, even though that's a little bit of a problem to unpack exactly what the literature shows. But even to just reduce religion to that, I thought was kind of like very wrong-headed. And then another thing that was quite popular, which is still quite popular today, maybe even more, is kind of like the focus on ritual, which I think is very important. But people are always focused on like, oh yeah, religion is good, but like it's because it has all these ritualistic elements of it, and then it has stress reduction, it helps people regulate and whatnot. And then it's funny that you mention kind of like, oh, religion has all these positive aspects to it. I actually don't like that approach at all, because it kind of feels very similar to this kind of like ritualistic explanation, which is like, oh, they're just doing, because then you kind of view religion as kind of like this technology in the worst possible sense. But it doesn't actually mean that it's any good, right? Like it's kind of similar to a lot of the philosophical arguments that people try to unpack on the psychedelic experience, which is like, even if everything goes better, like maybe it goes better while we have a worldview that is more detached from the real, and then what good is that, right? So I'm very skeptical of like all these health. I mean, it's not skeptical. Skepticism isn't the right word, but I just think it's fundamentally the wrong way to pursue it. And when I started really looking deep into religion, like really trying to understand what it might be at its deepest, most philosophical and theological levels, in my opinion, it's always about narrative. It's always about stories, about how people relate to the stories. And like, none of that has anything to do with like hyper agency detection.
No.
Nothing has to do with like stress reduction. So it just felt like these people don't even understand what religion is, and they're trying to study it. So I'm just wondering, like, how exactly do you see the contemporary fields of cognitive science of religion and psychology of religion in relationship to how well it matches the religious experience? And obviously, you already covered some of that. It's kind of like your personal experience.
Yeah, so it's a complex question. So the cognitive and evolutionary approaches in religion have progressed since the hyperactive agent detection theory, and they're still alive and kicking. And they have their own conferences. There's another one upcoming in Brno this year in Czechia, with their own researchers. And a lot of that research is based in evolutionary approaches to explain religion. And to me, it seems that the field has shifted a bit from trying to find innate cognitive modules. That was the old-fashioned modularity approach in evolutionary psychology, that we have evolved modules to deal with specific challenges in the environment, and as a byproduct they might have produced religious beliefs. But it seems the field has shifted from that approach towards more emphasizing that religion might be adaptive in many different ways, for instance, in terms of fostering health, fostering reproduction, facilitating group cohesion, facilitating cooperation. And there's a lot of anthropological and historical data that now speaks to this issue, that societies that had some kind of belief in supernatural punishment had longer existence and longer longevity than societies without belief in those agents. So there's research that is still ongoing, but it is indeed like having a very distant perspective on religion, trying to explain how it ever came about and what are the ultimate forces making people and societies more religious. Then on the other hand, you have the field of the psychology of religion and spirituality, which is mostly most strongly based in the US, and have a lot of their own research programs and their own divisions, Division 36 of the American Psychological Association. But a lot of that research is focused on contemporary Western Christians and their belief systems. And a lot of that research is also focused on the health benefits of religion and spirituality. So, of course, it's good to be critical and wary of potential biases and confounds in the field. And that research is also being critiqued for being, of course, very selection biased in terms of the participants recruited and the measures included, etc. But that seems to be like the characterization of the two main fields. And also, it has been pointed out quite frequently that the topic of religious experience has not ever taken a very central place in either field. So it's either the more evolutionary or cognitive approaches or the more coping, religion and health approaches. But religious experience seems to fit better in the fields of altered states of consciousness, or that is where it has been taken seriously. But it's not something that features centrally in either of those fields.
Right. And it's actually funny how you framed it at the end, because I also think that's super problematic, which is like this, it's either this like super abstract, like evolutionary and cultural drivers of religion, where you're looking at insane like spans of time, or it's kind of like, oh, this is actually 5 minutes of religious experience. And it's like, again, that's not what religion is about. Like religion for the average person is their day to day. So it's like if you close up so much, like most people aren't just having religious experience on a daily basis, but like if you go, to a church or a mosque or whatever, like what religion means to them is the lived experience. It's kind of like I'm looking for salvation in the terms that they put it. They have struggles. They are inheriting cultural mechanisms to help with those struggles. And to me, like, that's religion one-on-one, and like the whole tradition that comes before it. So it's like, if you look at evolutionary, massively sociological explanations, or even the mystical experience, like, you're still not covering the topic you're supposed to cover, I think. Yeah,
indeed. Yeah. But also speaking to your skepticism or criticism of religion health claims, indeed, I mean, there are many explanations for why religion might be fostering health in terms of group cohesion, social support, coping, etc. And of course, you can also point out all the negative effects that religion has in terms of actually fostering between group competitiveness and in-group favoritism and stereotyping and etc. But still, for instance, and then going back to my church that I grew up in, and that's an example I've often used to explain the placebo effect, which is a topic I've investigated myself. If I look at how the placebo effect is optimized within faith healing ceremonies, that is such a powerful mechanism that makes people feel really better. And in a sense, it works for psychosomatic complaints really well. So people really recover due to the group pressure, the charismatic faith healer, the expectations, the music, all coming into play. That creates a very powerful placebo effect that is really difficult to match otherwise. Like a psychiatrist can tell his patients, I really think this pill is going to help you. This is really the thing you probably need. But it only works so in terms of triggering expectations. Mm-hmm. So I've always been intrigued by how well they design the ceremonies to create that kind of vibe. And for instance, the Sunday Assembly, the atheist church, actually was looking at evangelical churches to model their experience to create also some kind of experience that might be beneficial and might be uplifting for people. I find that an interesting observation.
Yeah, for sure. And I just remember a funny analogy of how I think a lot about these health outcomes, which is like, even though they're interesting to look at, I really do think that they're very wrong-headed in looking at that primarily, because it's kind of like the same thing as me telling you about, I don't know, the love that you feel for your wife, that now I'm going to tell you, oh, love has all these positive health outcomes, and it has this and this like neurochemistry that then has all these consequences down the line. So like, okay, cool. But like, that tells me absolutely nothing about why I love my wife. Yeah. Right. So in my opinion, it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Fair point. Yeah.
So I read one of your papers about absorption and the spiritual experience. And I found that very interesting. And it was very well written. And I really liked the overview. Also, there's a fair bit of stuff that I wasn't familiar with. But I think this paper is actually quite crucial about how I view how we conceptualize the world, and then how that then trickles down into kind of how we think about psychedelic experiences. And so, first of all, one of the things that I definitely agree was kind of like this notion of that there's kind of like a top-bottom construction that you make about your beliefs, and therefore that's why they're malleable, and also obviously there's then a trait that kind of like modulates that to some degree, which is kind of the absorption. But and forgive me if I'm not as charitable as I could be. I'm not sure. I'll have to reread it very carefully to see how fair I'm being. But a lot of times I did read implicitly kind of how this trait of absorption is mentioned, and I'll tell you kind of how I feel about it, and maybe you can tell me if maybe I'm overinterpreting. But a lot of times it's talked about almost as if like there's a threshold of outside influence. So like there's a model of the self, there's a model of the world, and then like what's the barrier between them, which is fine. That's almost like the definition of the phenomena that you're trying to investigate. But a lot of times there's this assumption, but it's kind of like the inside is kind of like what is real, and then like there's a shields that can be removed or kind of like lessons in order to encounter whatever is outside. And to me, that strikes me as a little bit odds. And one of the things that I kept thinking about when I was reading the paper is like all this absorption stuff, like that's not like obviously it's a trait in the sense that there's individual variability, like within the typical way that psychologists define it. But like to me, it's like this is just a basic feature of cognition, number one. And then also this is very related to imagination, which you didn't go there explicitly either at all, or at least very little from where I remember. So, and obviously imagination is how you make stuff up, but also it's about how you encounter possibility in the world, like any kind of possibility. Even in predictive processing, this is already kind of implied, I think, to some degree. It's kind of like you have to construct the model, and you have to construct the model of what is not yet real in order to encompass the real. Especially if you take like an evolutionary approach of like how an animal might think about, moving somewhere because it has built a model, right? That doesn't exist yet. Like the animal is imagining that in some sense, even if you strip all subjectivity. And for example, here's a quote that you have on the paper. I mean, obviously, I know it was with several people. How many people were there?
We co-authored with three. So
Three, okay.
Herman and Michael Lifshitz.
Okay, sweet. So obviously I'm oversimplifying when I say you, but people have it in mind. Yeah, exactly. So experiencing the unreal has the more real, for example. That's how it was phrased. And this was in the context of like ambiguous sensory input. And then there's another quote, which wasn't on that paper. I think it was, on a podcast or something. And this was you. So for example, an item like I had an experience that felt more real than real already presumes the existence of a belief in something more real than real. And that conflates the belief that something like this exists. Already, it kind of assumes that belief already. It's kind of implicit. And the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because I feel like that always has like this model in mind of we know what is real. And then the absorption is kind of like you're losing yourself from the real towards the other. And I think this is super relevant to psychedelics. I think that's almost the entire crux of the field to many ways, in my view, because it kind of assumes that you know what the real is, and it assumes that deviations from that is an error. And this is so difficult to talk about because when people listening to this, they automatically think I'm thinking about some kind of like supernatural thing, as if kind of like losing that. When I say the real, that people assume that, I don't know, it's some ghost or something that I can be in contact with if I just have this trait of kind of like being able to absorb outside experience or outside concepts in some way. But that's not what I mean. I mean it in a very basic way of how we construct models of reality. And those models are real, even though they're not physical in a straightforward way. And so the way that I view this whole absorption imagination thing is that it's about participation in something that can be abstract. And I think that's the most helpful way to think about it. Like, I think all this talk about the real, like, we don't know what the real is. Like, the real is very complicated, very context dependent. I think all this talk is just very not helpful. I think the proper way to see it is when you imagine something, you're kind of like participating into other levels of reality. And then those can be either helpful, they can be transformative, like, for example, the typical outcomes that you expect from psychedelic therapy, or they can be maladaptive, like, for example, that you think that, someone is chasing you, or that your grandma is haunting you or something. So this is kind of like what I kept coming back to as I was kind of reading this kind of literature and kind of like how you typically phrased it. Also, if you're familiar with Charles Taylor, his kind of notion of the buffered self and the porous self, that also came to mind. And so I feel like I'm afraid that this type of paradigm doesn't do justice to the basic role of imagination in the human experience. And I don't know if maybe I'm misinterpreting a little bit kind of like your stance, or at least kind of like the paradigm that is implicit in this type of model.
Yeah, great points. I think the paper by now is 6 years old, and my thinking has progressed ever since. So maybe it's time for an update, Absorption 2.0 or something. Because indeed, I can't recall exactly to what extent we discuss imagination and mental imagery in that paper. But the notion of real and real making comes up quite frequently. And I think there are several points that I want to make in response to what you just said. The first one is that the sense of real or unreal as a very like sober definition, if you apply it within the context of an experiment, and you try to see if people who differ in this trait of absorption perceive things that are not present in the stimuli. So, for instance, I think we might discuss the white Christmas test, where you present white noise to participants, just static noise, on a headphone, and you ask them, whenever they hear Bing Crosby's White Christmas, press a button. The song is never there, but people start hallucinating the thing and perceive as if the song is real. And that is like a very operational definition of what real means, in terms of like when people press the button, they perceive something to be real that is not really there in terms of the sound of the stimuli. So that is how you can narrowly define it and operationalize it within the context of an experiment. But I think a lot of the thinking in the paper is also driven by Tanja Luhrmann's framework that I mentioned before, where she discusses the process of real making. And that strongly ties in indeed with mental imagery. So she talks about Pentecostal Christians practicing in prophecy and practicing in voice hearing experiences of God, and that over time their experiences become more subjectively real. So there's a felt realness to the experience that has a subjective compelling component, and that is not said to be untrue, but in this, it is explained in terms of a psychological mechanism that helps us to explain how, at least at the psychological or neural level, we can actually understand how those experiences have a very compelling sense of realness in terms of, for instance, the fine-grainedness of the experience. And that is where my thinking has progressed ever since. So, for instance, the quote that you just listed reminds me of a very good paper by Leo Roseman and Marco Daquil, who talk about the perceived realness of psychedelic experiences. So people who have taken psilocybin or smoked DMT very often say that they encountered something that is more real than real. Well, what does that mean? Well, subjectively, they feel as if what they encountered there has a more veridical or a more true quality than what we perceive with our eyes open. And I think that experience can be explained, and they explain this through neural models, in the sense that the pixels on our retina are limited by, in terms of like the amount of pixels that cones and rods that we have in our retina. So that limits the spatial resolution of what we perceive. But psychedelics stimulate our visual areas from the inside out, so to say. And that results in a visual experience that is more fine-grained than you would ever be able to see with your eyes open. And our brain takes the fine-grainedness as a cue to what is real or not real. But Loftus' research on memory shows this, that real memories have more detail than false memories. And there's a lot of research pointing in that direction. So that is how our mind works, by inferring felt realness based on the fine-grainedness. And based on that account, it makes sense to understand these experiences as having a very compelling sense of realness, just due to the fine-grainedness of the experience and how they come about, if that makes sense. But I see a skeptical look on your face, so I'm curious, where you...
No, I'm just trying to think where to pick it up. So like what you mentioned about perception makes sense. Like, yeah. I agree with that. And obviously this is very subjective. Like this would require a lot of unpacking that we don't have time for. But I would say the biggest takeaway, in my opinion, of when you evaluate claims of being more real than real is the very notion of realness, and also the fact that they're making the claim. Like to me, like that's actually one of the things that interested me in psychedelics in the first place. Like the fact that someone told me this feels more real than, I'm like, what do you even mean, and how can possibly that be correct? Especially from smart people. It's like, reality is this real? Like, how can you claim something is more real than real? Now, what you said about perception makes sense, but like I think that's a very small piece of it. Like certainly from my experiences, not even once I considered the level of realness to be perceptual in any way. And I know that some people do take that, but I also know that a lot of people goes beyond that. I think it has way, way more to do with your sense making rather than perceptual things in your experience.
Yeah.
And I think this is especially the case because the reason why these experiences have so much import a lot of the times is because they have very abstract notions that are not perceptual, like God, like selfhood, things like that. And so they don't say God is ultimately real if they do have that kind of experience, even if they change their minds, not because they saw God in much more detail. It's kind of like it's their whole being that has a mode of cognition that to them has never been available before. Like it completely changes their affordances, and that's kind of what makes these flashes of insight occur. And so when I think people say this felt more real than real, always what I think is kind of like, okay, their sense of realness has changed in some way, or it has picked up on something that forces them to reevaluate how they construct, like what the actual word means, like when it's real. Which is funny enough, when in the beginning of the conversation where I was trying to define my position of like reality is inherently religious, the reason why I made that jump and kind of like step back out of atheism, let's say, even though I hate all these labels, was precisely that. It's kind of like religion is more real than real. And like I say that in a way that is not perceptual at all. It's just because my definition of real allows me to make more sense of the religious experience, not in the sense that it's mystical, but in the sense of like how it's a framework on top of my life that serves me as an orientation. So when you start mentioning perception, I'm like, that makes sense. But like I feel
story.
Yeah, I feel like it's a very, very small part.
But it's also just possible that there are many pathways to realness, right? So visual might be one. I think it's a highly underestimated pathway, and it's also what Roseman and Dakil point out, that the visual effects have been largely ignored in psychedelic science,
right?
Because they can also instill, for instance, a very strong sense of beauty exists, or there's absolute truth. Because I see such beauty, I didn't realize that there were actually absolute values in terms of what is out there. Or it might be meaning, but that experience might be different for everyone. But still, the mechanism is kind of similar. It is that you experience something that you would not be able to experience in your ordinary state due to the pharmacological state of your brain. And that triggers this sense of felt realness. But in a way, it is not very different. And that's where I see the analogy with religious experiences, with the process of real making in any religious ritual or practice. Because if you start practicing tantric yoga, at a certain point, you will start feeling that the chakras are real as we are sitting here. And that will also take on a reality of its own. Due to engaging your mind in that practice, it will become real, subjectively real, that is. And then I remain agnostic about the metaphysical implications of that.
Right. Yeah, I would love to pick that further, because I think at some point, kind of like that kind of phenomenology, let's say, of like feeling something as real and kind of like constructing that and then like amplifying that experience. I do think that then you're able to extrapolate that a little bit on kind of like your definition of real in a more common sense way. Because I mean, this always depends on like how you even define real, like philosophically, like what are your foundations. But when you talk, for example, about this yoga thing, like the way that I think about truth, in a lot of ways, and it's a very complex topic, but like it's always something that you can leverage. It's kind of like when something is real, it means that it's present to you, and it's present to you in a way that it matters. So it's kind of like it's something that you can maneuver to some degree in a more positive or less positive direction. And so, and something that I think is also very missing from some of these, for example, when you mentioned kind of like this operational definition of truth in like the context of an experiment, for example, I assume that what you're interested in knowing is the level of truth within the experiment itself, right? So it's like you're in this state, is this real or not? Yeah. But what's so special about psychedelics, and again, what completely blew my mind when I was younger, is kind of like people make these claims outside that state. And then they have all their circle of credibility and culture saying, no, what you experience isn't real, because that doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. But then the person still says, no, it is real, right? And even if it's very counterintuitive, And even if they're very educated, they might be PhDs in psychology, they might be philosophers, they might be anything really. And I think that speaks again to this notion of that their framework has been reevaluated, and the fact that they have this epistemic position after the fact means that when you construct something out of reality, you might say, oh yes, sure, that feels real in the present because of all these, neurological processes of kind of like how your brain constructs something. But then like if that's long lasting and they can remove themselves from the experience, be critical of it, but then still say, no, that was real. I think that needs to be taken very, very seriously. I think that's the crux of the psychedelic experience. But that is very philosophically.
But I wonder if that happens and if there's actually data to back that up. I mean, there are some studies showing metaphysical belief changes after people have taken a psychedelic. But I would be inclined to think that if you don't act on those insights, they will remain rather ephemeral. So personally, I've had paranormal experiences during psychedelics or very strong energetic experiences. And if I would have dived into or alien encounters in psychedelic experiences, and I'm sure that if I would have practiced and started diving more deeply into paranormal phenomena and fostering that kind of framework, I would have had more paranormal encounters in my daily life as well. But I didn't do that. And I now not debunk, but at least think, well, of course, those experiences were there and felt real in the moment, but are explained by me taking a chemical substance, and hence my brain conjures up these things. And I still think that is the most parsimonious explanation of these experiences. I had a conversation at this workshop with the ufologist, the guy who does research on UFOs. Yeah. So I think that is a very good example where many people would agree or would be inclined to think, well, UFOs do not exist. There's very little evidence that actually aliens visit Earth. But I'm sure that if you start diving more deeply into that topic and you immerse yourself in that literature and you take some psychedelics and you reinforce those beliefs, that it will become real and you will become convinced that UFOs actually exist. But I didn't go down that rabbit hole. I think because I know what it feels like to go down this rabbit hole, given my Pentecostal background, that if I immerse myself, it will become real. And I've been in that reality, and I'm actually quite happy with the sober, naturalistic perspective that I endorse right now, which is, of course, also reinforced by what I surround myself with.
Right. Yeah. I totally understand that. There's some other things that I'd like to unpack, but I'm going to try not to take too much of your time. Something that I would love to get into on psychedelics is that one of the things that I dislike the most about the field is that it has this assumed like pathological model, which is like someone is mentally ill, which is sort of already begins on how you define it in the first place. Yeah. So like there's a lack of some kind. Here, take a pill, have this experience that has been empirical validated, supposedly to have some benefits, and then you go back to baseline. Okay, now you're good. You're not depressed anymore. Go back to work. And I think that's very problematic for a lot of reasons. But I would say the most important is that it completely misses. And again, this is why I think it's very important to connect it to religion, as we were talking about right in the beginning, because these kinds of experiences were always within the context of the human experience towards transcendence as kind of like this long-term goal, individual goal through time and also collective goal. And that is the complete opposite of this medical model of just like, you're sick, you get well, okay, now you're fine again, go back to work, do your normal life. So it's two completely different things. And I'm afraid that as we sink further and further in the normalization of psychedelic science, that will become a model that we can't even look past to, which has already happened to some degree. So I'm just wondering if this is something that you have in mind, if you agree, and how you think this is kind of going to progress over time.
Yeah, I definitely share that concern, and that's currently what is happening. The more biomedical approach to psychedelics give, where people are given a high dose with a hope, and they hope for the best, that it will be beneficial. And I think this approach is currently needed to actually get regulatory approval for these substances. And hopefully once they are there, we can think about the frameworks that need to be in place for actually the responsible administration of psychedelics. But that's currently not the focus at all. And I understand the biomedical approach from the regulatory and the pharmaceutical side of things, but I think it's really flawed because without any further support or integration or a broader perspective, it's not going to help anyone. And there I really embrace the complexity, 4E approach, embodied, embedded, extended, and active cognition, that if you want to think about what makes a person feel well, it doesn't make sense to only look at biology or genes or taking a medicine, but it's always a package of everything, including the society in which one lives, the neighborhood, the friends, the social network. If you have a daily structure, if you have work that feels meaningful to you, if you have relationships with friends or a partner that give meaning to life. So all those factors jointly affect how a person feels rather than only their chemical imbalance supposedly in the brain. So I'm very critical of that approach. And also personally, I have taken psychedelic substances and I've had profound insights, but they have not actually fostered my well-being. In order to actually, for personally feel better, I had to act on those insights in terms of like engaging in a more healthy diet or a more regular physical exercise or taking on less work to reduce the stress. But this was not the psychedelic or the substance itself that provided that solution. Only maybe some insights that I might have acted on in consequence.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting because like that's a lot of where my work falls that I'm trying to do. But yours was a bit more pragmatic in nature, which is fine. But I take that, but within a spiritual context, which I think a lot of the current problem with psychedelics is that they treat, like we're kind of forced to talk about the spiritual to some degree because that's how people describe the experience. So it's quite weird now that actually even within the scientific paradigm, people are using all these mystical terms and spiritual terms on them because you kind of have to. There's no other way. But then they get completely decontextualized of their original meaning. Mm-hmm. And so people have these experiences and they're like, okay, now you had a big experience. Yeah. Now you go back. And I think that's why a lot of the results aren't promising, because I feel like what you were now just describing of like, I had the insight, now I need to act on it. I think that's what's missing from the current paradigm of psychedelic research, which is like the way that I typically frame it is that psychedelics are kind of like a doorway, what I call to the sacred, which, you know, is very hard to kind of grapple with, but we can just leave it for now. People have this intimation that that life is meaningful to a maximum degree, and also that there's a story that they can latch onto to some degree. And this is very difficult to articulate, but people come out of it with this sense that that meaning is real in the most, again, it comes back to like how you conceptualize the real, which is like you can take this position of like be intellectually somewhat respectable, at least internally consistent, of like, you know, the world is just a place of objects, you know, kind of reality is just like unfolding according to the laws that be set on the Big Bang, whatnot. But that's very different than the human experience. But it's very hard to make that jump philosophically. But people can experience that, which is like, no, actually, the world is meaningful at its core. Like it's embedded into consciousness, and that has all kinds of implications about how I live my life. But that is the insight. It's your insight of I need to exercise, I need to work less, I need to pay more attention to my family, right? But then it needs to be acted out. Yeah. And how is this acted out in the typical religious context? Is through ritual, through community, right? But this is precisely the things that are, again, not given proper attention. Because again, if you come back to cognitive science of religion, why are you doing the ritual? Because it like reduces stress levels. Yeah. No, I'm doing a ritual because it is my action towards the self-transcendent goals that I've set myself into and that are connected to the religion that I'm trying to connect myself with, because I feel like that framework is the most real, in the sense that it has the most explanatory and actionable power in the things that matter the most to my life.
Yeah, but again, there I would be very wary of appropriation of religious tradition. So I hear in your saying that we should pay tribute to the religious or spiritual context in which psychedelics are used, and that it's really difficult to kind of separate them from the way in which they actually should be used in terms of ritualistic structure or a community that provides support. But that is not something we can easily adopt from indigenous perspectives. And I'm actually very wary of approaches that try to learn from the elderly or the wise by putting an old shaman on stage and that he knows how we should use psychedelics in the West, or on psychedelic retreats that we have in the Netherlands where people dress up in white robes and they play spiritual music and they put some Buddha statues. And I actually think that is also a kind of very limited and narrow approach to how psychedelics can be used. And I'm actually also sometimes thinking we should be more open to the fact that these substances can also be used in a highly secularized Western context without all the religious or spiritual baggage. And Eric Davies has actually pointed out that we might actually rethink about the whole therapeutic spiritual approach should also be complemented by a more fun or recreational approach that actually puts these substances in a different perspective. So, for instance, we've done research at parties where people microdose or take higher doses of psilocybin, and there it turns out that people actually become really talkative and intimate, and that it can also have those effects rather than all the serious, meaningful, profound effects. So I think that's also strongly context-bound, and it's important to realize that we don't have those frameworks in place in the West, and it's not easy. It cannot be easily exported from how they are used in indigenous communities. So we probably need to work towards a model where we have, for instance, a retreat where people can go to for their psychedelic experience. And then when they go back, they are supported by their psychiatrists or psychologists who can provide support for integrating that experience, because we cannot expect every person to have that kind of background or social support to do it within their own community.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe I misspoke or I misread it a little bit. I actually wasn't thinking of like this indigenous kind of structure to it. What I meant was more like in the sense of like a spiritual tradition. Like once you make, obviously not everyone has this kind of experiences, but a lot of the times, at least based on my experience of being in the psychedelic community, of talking with a lot of people, is that people have this epiphany, let's say, and then they kind of don't know what to do with it. So I'm not necessarily saying that we should go back to the like how psychedelics were used, but in the sense of like psychedelics open up this space for spirituality, but then it's like, what do I do? What does spirituality mean? And then I'm like, well, there's wisdom traditions that have trying to grapple this since forever. I can't tell you which one is right. No one can, but you can kind of like try to find yourself into it. And then you can use that as a map, again, based on all these senses of realness that I've been trying to articulate. But I agree with you with kind of like the problems that entails. About the more recreative notions of it, I do try to take that into account, but I do think that's very dangerous. Dangerous in the sense of like culturally dangerous, of like how that might end up down the line. But yeah, that's another talk for another time, maybe. Switching now a little bit to the topic of science itself and psychedelic science, which is obviously kind of like your day-to-day. I'd like your take of like, what do you think are the most common misunderstandings of the field, either from the layman, that maybe like the average, psychedelic enthusiast, but also like even scientists themselves or like academics that are related to the field. What do you think are the most common misunderstandings within?
I think the most common misunderstanding in the general public is that psychedelic substances can be used to successfully treat depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. Because if you closely look at the evidence, it just doesn't back up that these substances are safe or are actually efficient treatments for these pathologies. And if I were to name one biggest misconception among scientists, it would be that psychedelics work by resetting the brain, by making new connections, by fostering connectivity between different networks, and hence resulting in a mental reset. That's a very compelling idea. And entropic brain hypothesis and rebus model have been really influential and are very interesting theoretical ideas that unfortunately are currently not yet backed up by the empirical data. So It's a bold statement, but I really think we should be cautious with those explanations.
Yeah, and when you mentioned kind of like the lack of efficacy for certain mental conditions, do you mean that more in the sense that people think that there's a lot of strong evidence and there just isn't? Or do you think there's actually work that has been, that not only just like failed to replicate, but like more in the sense of actually disproving the efficacy rather than being an absence of strong evidence?
No, it's more the first. So there is evidence, but it's not as strong as people are actually thinking it is. So I think the general person would expect that psychedelic therapy might be approved anytime because of all the positive media reporting over the past 5 or 10 years. And I think actually many people will be surprised to hear that it's not even close to being approved, given all the challenges the companies face, regulatory agencies face, but also if basically the lack of very strong evidence that we currently have for the efficacy of psychedelics.
Right. So, like, what would be your estimate of like how far we are, if you think this will even kind of be a reality at all?
It's difficult to say, but I think if the next phase 3 trial of Compass Pathways will come out, that is like a next big major step, and that might lead to applications for approval at the EMA in Europe, maybe in 2 years or so from now, and then maybe approval of psilocybin for depression within 5 years. But again, that also depends on the efficacy data, and that did not look very promising given the latest press release where they showed that it results in a 2.6 point difference on a 60-point depression scale for psilocybin compared to placebo. So the results are really disappointing in a way, and were not as strong as we were hoping for.
Yeah. I'm going to have to backtrack a little bit on my promise of letting philosophy go. But I'm just wondering, like from my perspective, when I hear that, I have my own hypothesis, which is obviously very subjective and can be 100% wrong. But I think the reason why that's the case is because I don't think it's being done very well, either on kind of like what these substances potentially mean, but also even more importantly, on kind of the integration process that I think is so important to be done afterwards, that it's neglected, I think. And even when it's not neglected, I think it's just not, even though people are trying to take care of it, I just don't think it's being done very well. But obviously that's a very biased personal opinion. I'm just curious about how you think about the problem if you're trying to kind of like reevaluate, if you kind of take the premise, let's say from personal experience, that these substances are effective, but then if the trials don't show that it's that effective, like how do you approach that? Like, what are your hypotheses that you come up with, if any, and kind of like how would you try to reassess, especially, and maybe this is impossible, especially if you don't have like infinite like empirical resources, right? So it's like you might say, oh yeah, maybe this would work. So I'd set up study A, B, and C, and then I would see it. But obviously you can't do that because you need a few million that you don't have. So it's like from a more theoretical perspective, like how do you position the potential improved efficacy of psychedelics?
Yes. So I have 3 things to say in response to that. The first is the methodological issues. So I've pointed out the 10 problems in the methods that are used to evaluate efficacy in randomized controlled trials, such as breaking blind, expectations, etc. So one approach would be to improve the methodological rigor, avoid the breaking blind problem, for instance, by giving people different dosing regimens of psychedelics, so that makes it more difficult to figure out what dose they've been assigned to. So that is actually the route that most pharmaceutical companies are now taking, and also that many universities are now taking. For instance, Johns Hopkins is working along these lines. The second approach that I see is how we think about mental problems. And in those randomized controlled trials, we try to put people in boxes. So you fit in this DSM category. But if you actually looked at one depressed person and the other, the number of symptoms and the amount of symptoms can, and the specific symptoms can vary quite a bit from one person compared to the other. And in that sense, I've become much more favorable to so-called network approaches in psychiatry, that instead of saying this person is depressed, they classify it more in terms of a cluster of symptoms that more or less co-occur together, sometimes more often than others, but still it is a big mess. And how we demarcate autism from ADHD, from ADD, from depression, from anxiety, from PTSD, it's really messy. And if you think about that, you could maybe think more about targeting specific symptoms for people within that network, and that might be an approach that is more fruitful. And that brings me to the third thought I had, and that is that I think that if you think about it more in terms of like individualized networks where people might be struggling with different types of symptoms. So one depressed person may sleep very badly, very poorly, be very anxious, very stressed out, etc. That person might not benefit from a psychedelic experience. But if you have a person who is depressed and copes a lot with like existential anxiety, existential issues, emotional problems, that person might be better capable of benefiting from psychedelic therapy compared to the other subtypes. Because I think indeed, as you point out, psychedelics specifically act at that meaning level, at that existential level. And this is where I think you can, and that is where research should probably go in terms of precision medicine or tailoring approaches to individualized patients, to find out for whom psychedelic therapy might actually work, and better characterizing the different types of depressive patients that we treat and that we currently pull all together in those randomized controlled trials, and hence we end up with very small effect sizes. But at the same time, I've read into precision psychiatry and the whole discussion on biomarkers, that with sufficient resources, we would be able to profile which person might benefit from SSRIs or cognitive behavioral therapy. That whole discussion has been a promise for more than 2 or 3 decades and has not resulted in any tangible application in psychiatry. So also there I'm really skeptical that even though in theory it might seem a good idea to customize approaches to individual patients, but how do you go about this? Because the complexity is so enormous that it's really difficult to find out how this should be done in practice. So that is my long answer, but I think this is a kind of characterization of what I see happening in the field.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. And it's funny that you mentioned kind of the inherent categorization of what you're supposedly trying to treat, because now I just had a kind of a flash memory that when I first started getting into psychology in my undergrad, so like quite a while ago, I remember reading a lot of like critiques of psychiatry, and I thought the arguments and the evidence was pretty good. And so I was like, surely this is like in 5 years, like this is going to start massively changing. Like people are going to realize this. And it's like, and now looking back, it's been more than 5 years. I think nothing has changed. I think the strength of the critique, I think, is exactly on the same place. I think we made zero progress whatsoever. And it's just crazy. So I definitely agree with you there. Also on your last point, I was a little bit confused about your first point though, because like, the way that I framed the question was like kind of like, how can you make this more effective if you kind of start from that premise? But then you mentioned kind of like some methodological problems with studies. But for example, the blinding, isn't the blinding like it's a flaw, but isn't amplifying the effect rather than reducing it?
True. Yeah. So that is more. So indeed, that was not a response to the question: how can we make it more effective? But how can we better control for
I see.
the effectiveness? And we need to conduct better research according to the guidelines to address the methodological problems, to control for potentially confounding factors in terms of driving efficacy. But on the other hand, and this is something I've also thought about a bit, is that currently the selection bias is seen as a problem in this field. That currently people with positive expectations or prior positive psychedelic experiences sign up for the clinical trials. And that results in selection bias because they already have positive expectations, it might result in inflated effect sizes. But rather than seeing this as a confound, I was actually thinking we should maybe just accept that psychedelic therapy is not for everyone, but should be specifically targeted for people who already have at least the slightest inkling that it might help them, because otherwise why would you administer the therapy in the first place? Because we know from all the therapies that you have to have some positive hope or expectation on behalf of the patient that it will help them. And if the person is completely anxious about, I will never take a psychedelic substance, but it's my last resort, it's probably the prospects are not that good. So rather than seeing it as a confound, I've been thinking maybe we should just acknowledge that this will never be a therapy that will cure depression in general, but might be for a select few depressed patients who already have expectations that psychedelics or altered states might help them.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Is there any research? Because like that kind of scenario that just described, of like psychedelics are my last resort, even though I really don't feel like taking them. I really don't think it's for me, but I'm just out of options. Like that seems to be more and more of reality nowadays. Like, is there any research that compares the outcomes of that particular group compared to the average group that participates in trials?
No, not really. But it was pointed out as a confound by the FDA in the rejection of MDMA-assisted therapy that 40% of the people participating in the MDMA for PTSD studies had prior experiences with MDMA. And they asked for a new study with a more representative sample because the average population's use of MDMA, I think, approximates to 10% or so in the US. I don't know if anyone has ever looked. There's a bit of data that we mentioned in the paper with Eiko Fried on how prior psychedelic use predicts effectiveness, pointing indeed in the direction that people with prior positive psilocybin or MDMA experiences seem to benefit more from the therapy. So that points in that direction.
Right.
But I agree. I mean, a similar point could be made for the breaking blind problem. Rather than seeing it as a confound, you could also see it as something that's actually driving parts of the effect. So rather than trying to control for it, we should actually maybe see how it can be enhanced or how the placebo effect can be enhanced. Or Ido Hartogson is an author I really admire, who has actually redubbed the placebo effect as a meaning response. So he says that the placebo effect can be considered as the meaning attributed to a specific phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And psychedelics amplify actually the meaning response by making people more sensitive to set and setting, and thereby can result in what he dubs a super placebo. And that can be, of course, used in psychedelic therapy by talking about what people can expect by using all types of elements that will result in a more strong mystical type experience, if that is the explanation that you think might be underlying psychedelic therapy, etc. So you can actually steer that effect also in potentially positive therapeutic directions.
Yeah, exactly. And also something that has been on my mind, but this is very loose and raw. But I was just reading L.A. Powell's work on transformative experiences recently, which is obviously very relevant to psychedelics, and kind of I don't mean this as a critique of the argument that she makes. It's more just like an overall thought, which is something that is common to the desire to transform, despite the fact that you have this epistemological gap that you can possibly make the evaluation of that transformation, is the fact of wanting to be transformed, which is precisely a lot of the psychology that you see with people that are interested in psychedelics. They have this notion of spiritual growth, of self-growth, right? At least maybe not so much now that it's so tied to medical conditions, but like if you look at the more classical psychedelic culture, those are the types of people that a lot of times are attracted to it, right? Because like, you know, a random person on the streets, they are not that interested, they might not be that interested in psychedelics, but they're also not that interested in the context which psychedelics sit under. So like if I talk with them about, you know, let's reevaluate kind of like what are your ontological assumptions or like your sense of self or like what meaning in life is, they might also not be very interested in those questions. So there's almost like a personality cluster around those things. But something that made me, I don't want to say this like straight up because I think it's too strong, but it's just a loose thought, which is like another way to think about it is maybe that cluster of traits and dispositions are needed very much within the line that you were saying. But also another aspect might be, what if you can cultivate that trait and then make, obviously this has like a bit of an ethical, you know, dimension to it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there's anyone that even kind of remotely thinks about this. So it's just like, how do you cultivate the very desire of transformation and of kind of like expanding your horizons, which then might make you the person who might benefit from psychedelics? Does this strike you as like problematic territory?
No, it doesn't. I mean, ethically, it might indeed raise a couple of questions, but in principle, it's an interesting idea. But this brings us to the domain of personality psychology, I think. And there, as far as I have an overview of the field, I think the sobering conclusion is that these traits are relatively stable, and people might wiggle around a bit, but across the lifespan, people don't become an extrovert if they start out as an introvert. Yep. And people very low on openness to experience, which seems to be the key variable of interest here of the big five, will be difficult to become more open. And the few studies that have been reported on this, showing that after a psychedelic experience, people start scoring higher on openness to experience, did not really hold up in replication studies. So even a psychedelic does not really seem to induce lasting changes in one's personality. So I think it's really difficult to move people around in that direction.
That's a good point with kind of the fairly strong evidence that it's not very malleable. But I maybe this is just a bias, but I am very skeptical about the lack of replication of the trait of openness, because I've seen that so many times with like people that I've met. It's kind of like it's a change day and night, and I'm like, there's no way this is not real. I just encountered so many times, and I wonder what kind of, well, assuming I'm right, maybe I'm not, but I wonder what kind of funky methodological kind of procedure might be in place that kind of fails to capture the effect. Because I would be really, really surprised if there wasn't a change. I don't know if you experienced that on like the actual lived experience of like people that you...
Yeah, definitely. A lot of anecdotal evidence of people suddenly completely opening up and becoming much more interested in stuff they never shown an interest in before. So yeah, that I can relate to. I would have to look more closely at the actual studies on how this was conducted, at what time scale. Right. And why it does not replicate. But typically it would be a study in which you administer the Big Five personality questionnaire to see if this results in lasting changes. And that pertains to questions such as, when I go to vacation, I typically like to revisit the same location, or I like to have a predictable day, etc. And that captures a certain proclivity for being open to unexpected surprises. And I'm not sure if those items will indeed capture changes induced through psychedelics, because there's more content specific. People become more open in spiritual stuff or alternative practices or complementary and alternative medicine that might not be captured by the specific questions in that scale.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. That's actually that was actually my first intuition, is like the problem with the scale itself. But then I thought, the easiest problem is already what's on the scale, which is like very reliable, tested over and over again. But that's why I think the openness to experience is quite surprising. But yeah. So yeah, you've done a lot of work at this point. Something that I would like to ask you is like, what do you consider what you're most proud of? Like when you kind of reflect back on your entire career this far.
Oh, that's a difficult one. I don't know if there's any particular study that I'm really proud of. Well, for one thing, I would mention the Open Science of Religion project, or the Religious Replication Project. That was the name of it. This was a large-scale project where we conducted replication studies in the field of the psychology of religion and spirituality in 24 different countries across different cultures, 5 different continents, with a large sample. And we tried to replicate some basic findings and extend those findings. So I'm actually really proud of that achievement, and also of the fact that some of those findings actually hold up quite well. So the religion-health relationship was something we replicated. We focused on dualistic thinking, the idea that people have a predisposition for thinking about mind and body as separate entities, and that was something that also held up quite well, and it was modulated also by religiosity. And something that was a bit new, which we dubbed the Einstein effect, which is a very simple manipulation in which we presented vignettes with seemingly profound meaningful statements that were actually generated by a bullshit generator with some jargon in it. And we attributed those statements either to a scientist or to a spiritual guru to see to what extent people would find the statements meaningful or profound and true. And across the board, we found, luckily for us, the scientists, that people attribute more credibility to statements attributed to a scientist, but it also depends on your worldview. So people with a more spiritual outlook actually rated both the spiritual guru and the scientist as quite meaningful. And this also replicated across different countries. So that is something that I thought was nice and funny to do.
Right. Yeah. Amazing work. And, you know, a lot of times there's kind of like a very funky relationship between science as it is done by itself compared to what the public perceives, and often the media is often there kind of like trying their best in their own limited way to kind of like amplify a lot of the research, but a lot of times there's a lot of stuff that gets lost in the translation. Is there anything that you think are like very common misunderstandings of your work, or kind of like your position in general that you kind of wish that you could correct, but somehow it has kind of like gone out there into the public?
No, not specifically, but I think a general challenge in science communication is to communicate the uncertainty around scientific findings. So any media report on study find X and Y differ compared to whatever often fails to communicate that any finding is surrounded by a certain confidence interval. And this is something that's really difficult to convey, like how we can qualify the uncertainty around any specific finding and how to properly translate that. We found this, but with a certain amount of uncertainty still.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what would be your ideal psychedelic study? Like if I was a billionaire and I really wanted to like get to the bottom of psychedelics, I gave you infinite funding, infinite resources, what would you set up?
Well, I would be very interested in systematically studying the interaction between set, setting, and substance. That's, of course, the golden grail in psychedelic science. Everyone talks about the effects of set and setting and the effects of context and the substance, but to what extent can you actually see these factors as like independent contributors to the psychedelic experience, or to what extent do they interact? And what is the role, for instance, of expectations compared to the substance itself? So if you tell a person you get LSD, but you actually give them MDMA or another substance, to what extent are top-down expectations actually driving the experience that people have? How does it interact with personality? So that would be a big study with a 2x2x2 design and taking personality into account. So this is something where I think lots can be gained, but a lot of that research is partly already happening. So in the US, they have this big initiative to systematically study the effects of setting on the psychedelic experience. So the first steps are being taken in that direction.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Looking forward to seeing that. And where are you seeing the fields in like 20 to 30 years? Either, maybe let's put it like this, either your actual prediction based on where you're seeing the scientific kind of consensus to be somewhat arriving at, and also the shift of the culture. But also I'm going to ask the broader question of like, where would you like to see the fields in 20 to 30 years from now?
Well, I think the field will be heading towards more clinical studies focusing on the efficacy and probably regulatory approval, more fundamental research trying to figure out the mechanisms underlying psychedelics, and probably also more clarity about working mechanisms with better techniques becoming available. What I'm really curious about is to what extent the current hype and enthusiasm around psychedelics will be sustained for a longer time, because in a way this field is exceptional in terms of the people attending the conferences, doing the scientific research, teaming up, connecting socially, because everyone is in the field typically because of out of personal interest and motivation. And I'm really curious to what extent this will hold up in the long term, and to what extent that enthusiasm can be sustained if these substances will become available as medicines, or if the legal landscape might change, or if the findings are not as promising as people were hopeful. So this is where I'm really curious. And my hope would be that in the end, the hype will diminish a bit more than it currently already does, so that we will have a more sober look at psychedelics. And in a way, the field will be a bit more similar to other scientific fields compared to, for instance, religion and spirituality, or the cognitive science of religion, with a more sober reporting and people with an interest, but not the psychedelic evangelism that I witness now still a lot at the major scientific conferences that I attended.
Yeah, that's interesting to think of that. And I'm trying to figure out how exactly would I predict that to go. But from my experience, when I do meet a lot of the people that have kind of gone into this field and they're very interested, a lot of times the story goes like this, which is like, I was not in a very good place in life. I was a bit disillusioned with life. And then I got interested in psychedelics. I started, I don't know, maybe watching some Terence McKenna or some Alan Watts or something. And then I got my curiosity picked in. And then I took psychedelics, and it's like all this new world of possibility opened up for me. Like this, the world isn't what I thought the world was. That's a lot of kind of how I see that framed. Yeah. And that's exactly how it went for me to some degree, not exactly along the exact same lines, but very similar in spirit. And I don't see how that would change, because this is precisely why I'm so interested in psychedelics, is because it's precisely this contrast to modern culture and the typical intellectual paradigm that people have on their heads, which is like when you take psychedelics, like even if you don't have any kind of theists or supernatural position whatsoever, it still feels like it points you to something like, again, this is very difficult to define, but I always come back to it. I think it's the best articulation that I can make of like something like the term of the sacred being intelligible to people, that they at least take it seriously, where in a typical materialistic worldview, it's very easy to say that's literally non-intelligible, like that like literally doesn't have meaning, which like someone in like very deep in analytic philosophy, for example, might take that position. And so I see that as almost like a remedy to culture. And I don't see how that would go away unless the culture changes. And my view is that if that does happen, then great, then we don't need psychedelics, actually. So everything would be solved.
Yeah. I see your point, but at the same time, I see a lot of parallels between what you're saying in terms of what is happening indeed when people report about having taken a psychedelic substance and then suddenly getting a new insight and changing their life. And what I witnessed happening in that Pentecostal community that we started out discussing, where people are in a very bad place and suddenly find Jesus and find a lot of meaning and dedicate their life to the church. And I see a similar thing going on in the psychedelic movement. But the question is, should that be in psychedelic science? I mean, it's okay that people find that community, find that support, find that meaning within psychedelic space, but it should not affect psychedelic science, because also we would be very wary of an evangelical Christian trying to prove that faith healing is real and actually cures people beyond the placebo effect, because God intervenes in those worship meetings. And this is where I'm still maybe again the more skeptical psychedelic scientist, where I witnessed those meetings in psychedelic conferences. It reminded me a lot of my Pentecostal background in terms of the enthusiasm around these substances, which I understand also from my personal experience. But then this is something different from actually doing good science on these substances. And that should be more neatly separated, I think. And this is where I'm curious where the field will be heading in the future, if that hype remains, or when indeed the interest becomes broader and there might also be people not having taken these substances or with less enthusiasm or more adverse experiences entering the field, if the science also becomes a bit more sober and down to earth.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And then lastly, I'd like to ask you, is there something that you're working on that we haven't covered, even though we covered a fair bit, but is there any project that maybe we didn't mention that you think are kind of like good to highlight?
Well, something I'm very proud of is that for a long time we've been trying to do research with natural products. So instead of natural psychedelics.
Oh, natural.
So instead of synthetic psilocybin, using magic mushrooms or using the magic truffles that are legally available in the Netherlands. Now, for the first time, we actually are about to start a study in a Dutch smart shop where people can consume the products on site, and we are able to record EEG and physiology and some questionnaire data to see how the effects compare to the substance that is used in the laboratory. Because I've always seen this as a big low-hanging fruit, that a lot of the research is focused on synthetic psilocybin, but the mostly consumed substance across the world is the magic mushroom. So hardly any person has access to synthetic psilocybin. So we need a better understanding of these natural compounds. This is now something we're working on. So yeah, curious what comes out of that.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to see how that goes. So yeah, that was all. Obviously, I could talk with you for many, many hours until nighttime, but this is a good place to end. I just want to really appreciate for you accepting the invitation and having this very fun conversation, and also just like a token of appreciation about your work as well, because like I mentioned in the beginning, I come from like a very scientific background, and I feel like as I transitioned, I suppose, to like a more philosophical way of doing things and thinking about the world, I feel like sometimes I miss the precision and the skepticism of kind of my younger scientific days, let's call it. And that's something that came very much to my mind as I was revisiting your work and kind of exploring what you do further. And to me, it was a bit of an eye-opener, which is like, actually, I do need to really stay on top of the literature and not slack off, because a lot of the times it's quite possible that some new evidence comes out that invalidates some of my assumptions, which then I'm building my philosophical framework on top. And it's very easy. This is one of the problems with kind of like replication, is that once you have the initial finding, like even if you don't want to, even if you have like the scientific integrity to avoid that bias, let's say, it's almost unavoidably human, I think, that just kind of settles in your brain, which is like, this is the effects that A has, and it has this type of outcome. And so like, now it's settled and now I can build on it. And then I think the work that you do also is very important, where it's kind of like, actually, let's investigate this better. Let's be a bit more skeptical. Yeah. And then a lot of times, if you take that Lego off, then a lot of things will crumble. So that's something that I appreciated a lot from reading your work. And kind of
thanks. It was great having this conversation. Thanks for the proposal.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening. Bye-bye.